Okay, couple of hours to the big game, people. Opening game of the season, so big effort this time. Hello, everyone. Go Pies! Well done. So pretty excited, as I said, a couple of hours to the big game, our first game of the season. So very happy, and excited about that. I apologise to anyone around me when I go back to the room to listen to the game. Any swearing that happens. Also happy and excited that my wife Leanne is going to rejoin the ship in Adelaide tomorrow. So looking forward to that. I've been walking around the ship whistling one day more from Les Miserables all day. So pretty happy. So today I'm going to talk to you about some of my heroes, and some of you may know some of these people, but to most people they'd be unknown. So that's why I've called it Unknown Heroes. And the first one I wanted to start with was a man by the name of Thomas Cochrane. Now we were in Valparaiso in Chile a couple of months ago, 6 weeks ago or something, and some of you may have seen the statues, the monuments to Thomas Cochrane in Chile, in Valparaiso and also in Santiago. There was a bit of talk about him when we were there. He was born in Scotland in 1775 to Scottish nobility. He was the oldest of 7 sons in this family, and all of whom went on to have very distinguished careers in either the military or the diplomatic service for the Crown. He joined the Royal Navy at the age of 17 and became a midshipman. This was at the outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars, where King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were deposed. They were beheaded in the guillotine, and the Reign of Terror began, which saw the execution of 16,594 noble men and women. He served aboard the ship HMS Hind with his uncle, also named Thomas Cochrane, as captain. And during that time, they captured or sunk 8 French vessels and also recaptured 2 British vessels that had been initially been captured by the French. He was commended for his initiative and for his bravery during that time, and he came to the attention of several high-ranking British officers. And so in 1796 he was promoted and transferred to the flagship of the fleet, which was HMS Barfleur. Now, that was a very famous ship in its own right. It had 98 guns. It was a ship of the line, the flagship, as I said, of one of the British fleets, and it fought in the American Revolutionary War, the French Revolutionary Wars, and the Napoleonic Wars. Most of the most famous officers in the Royal Navy went through and served on HMS Barfleur at some stage or another. But while he was serving on there as the 8th lieutenant, he was court-martialed for showing disrespect to the 1st lieutenant, a man by the name of Philip Beaver. Now Beaver was a fairly pompous sort of man, and during that court-martial he was told that he was a little bit precious about this whole situation, but Cochrane received his very first of many reprimands for being frivolous. For being disrespectful to Beaver, even though it was thought it to be a very frivolous sort of situation. But that came to the attention of a man who was Captain John Jarvis at the time, but went on to become Admiral Sir John Jarvis. And he and Cochrane had a difficult relationship for the rest of their careers. In February 1800, he was given his first command, which was of a prize ship that had been captured by the British fleet. He was ordered to take it back to a friendly English port. Now, the conditions were so bad, and because this was a prize ship, it didn't have a full crew. The conditions were very, very bad in the English Channel. There wasn't enough men to sail the ship, and Cochrane himself had to go up into the rigging and help haul in the sails so that they wouldn't be sails flapping around up there. And this gave him the reputation that he wouldn't do anything that he wouldn't order his men to do anything that he wouldn't do himself. He was then given command of HMS Speedy. Now this became a very famous ship as well. It was only a 14-gun brig, very small ship, but it won a lot of fame throughout the Royal Navy for what it achieved against heavy odds. When Cochrane first went on board the ship, he wasn't impressed at all. Below deck, it only had 5 feet of headroom, so he had to crouch everywhere he went under the decks. And he also complained that he could carry a whole broadside of ammunition in his pockets. It only took one broadside could take, there was 7 guns each side, and they only took 4 pounds of shot each. So he could carry one broadside in his pockets himself. Now, he had some amazing adventures aboard the Speedy. At one stage, the Speedy is also famous for the fact that of the 8 captains who captained the Speedy over its career, every single one of them went on to become admirals in the Royal Navy, something that's never ever happened before. On one occasion, a much larger Spanish ship was closing in on him. He wanted to avoid a battle with this ship, so he ran up the Danish flag and also ran up a flag indicating there was plague on board, so the Spanish left them alone. Another time he was being pursued by a French frigate, which was much more powerful than his ship. During the night, he put a lantern on a barrel and let it float away, and in the meantime went a different direction, and the frigate followed the barrel. Now, you might have seen that similar sort of thing in a movie on your TV, Master and Commander. You've seen that? Great movie, gives a really accurate portrayal of life in the Royal Navy at that time. But the character of Captain Jack Aubrey in Master Commander is based on Cochrane. He fought a duel with a French officer. They came into Malta one day. He was invited to a fancy dress party. Because he had just arrived in Malta, he didn't have a costume to wear, so he went dressed as an ordinary seaman, just as an ordinary able seaman. A French officer, a loyalist French officer, took offence and ordered him out. There was words exchanged, and in the end the French officer challenged Cochrane to a duel, which was fought. The French officer was wounded, Cochrane wasn't, and that was the only duel of his career. But in 1801, May 1801, he fought a very, very famous battle against the Spanish vessel, the El Gamo. Now, this was a 32-gun ship with 319 men aboard, compared to his much smaller 14 guns and only 54 men on board. Now, Cochrane approached the El Gamo. Anyone else would turn and try and run away from it, but he wanted to engage. And he flew the American flag, so the Spanish thought that he was a neutral, and they got in so close to the El Gamo before they opened fire that and they stayed at very close range, that the El Gamo's guns, because they were such a bigger ship, the guns couldn't angle down far enough to shoot at the Speedy. Even though one man of unusual height aboard the Speedy was decapitated by a cannonball shot by the El Gamo. Every time the Spanish men collected to try and board the Speedy, because it was so close, Cochrane would pull away slightly and start firing again. The Spanish would run back to their guns because they had a shot, and then Cochrane would come back in again. And this happened 4 times during that battle, until eventually the Spanish took such a toll from the gunfire from the Speedy that Cochrane was able to board the El Gamo, capture it, even though the odds were 5-1 against him at the time. So he became very famous for that. And in the 13 months that he was in command of the Speedy, they either captured, sunk, or caused to run aground 53 enemy ships, which was an amazing sort of feat at the time. And one of the things that Cochrane first thought of was rowing into French anchorages when the tide was going in. He and his men would get into boats, and with the incoming tide, they would sneak into these French harbours and anchorages, and they would either climb onto the vessels, overpower the sentries, and either capture the ships and sail them away with the crew locked down below, or they would set fire to these ships and to try and destroy them. If the sentries were too alert, they'd just cut the anchor cable, and because it was an incoming tide, those ships would be forced up onto the and beached. So he was very, very successful, and he became a national hero in England, and all the newspapers wrote stories about him and his success. In July 1801, he was captured by the French, and then 4 days later, he was exchanged for a French captain. Now, when Napoleon found out that this man who had caused him so much grief had been exchanged for just a mere French captain, he was furious, and he court-martialed the officer responsible for that exchange. In March 1802, the Peace of Amiens came about. The war was over, and he went to university in Edinburgh to trying to do some study there, but then only a year later, England and France were back at war again. And he took command of a ship called HMS Arab, which he said sailed like a haystack. It was an awful ship. Wasn't suited for the conditions of the North Sea or the Atlantic at all. And he got into trouble again here. He saw an American ship coming from a French harbour, and he assumed that there was contraband on board. So he boarded the vessel. There was an international dispute about it, and he was reprimanded again and sent off into the North Sea to patrol the North Sea to ponder his ways. He was then given command of HMS Pallas, which had 32 guns, and in a very short period of time he captured 5 and destroyed 5 French vessels, and then he was given command of HMS Imperius, which had 38 guns. And here he became even more famous because he would venture ashore. He'd take his men ashore, and on one occasion he actually captured the fortress of Mongat in Spain. And on that occasion, his men, his Marines, occupied the fort, and the battles they fought, this was a very strategic fort, and they held off Napoleon's army for over a month, held him up so he couldn't advance any further. And on another occasion, the French had signal stations along the coast of France, and they would signal to each other using either flags or semaphore. It was a favourite pastime of Cochrane to go ashore and destroy these signal bases so that the French couldn't communicate. It would disrupt their communications. And on one occasion, he actually captured French code books. He copied them out, and he left them in place so that the French wouldn't know that they'd been compromised, and for the next few weeks the English were able to read the French signals as they went. And then he captured Fort Trinidad in Spain, and this was another very strategic fort. At the time, he and his Marines held the fort for 2 weeks, held up Napoleon's army, and then he was the last to leave as the French tried to recapture the fort. And as he was leaving, he lit a gunpowder and blew up most of the fort, blew up all the munitions in the fort. The Battle of Basque Roads is a famous or infamous battle. The French fleet had been held up in the Bay of Basque Roads, which is in the Bay of Biscay. They were kept in there by the English Channel Fleet under the command of Admiral James Gambier, or as his men knew him, Dismal Jimmy. He didn't have a very good disposition at all. Dismal Jimmy wouldn't attack the French. He thought it was too dangerous to go into this bay to attack, and this frustrated a lot of the English. Cochrane was an MP at this stage. He'd been elected to Parliament for his Scottish constituents, and he was at a restaurant in London one day, and the First Lord of the Admiralty happened to walk past and sit at his table. And he asked Cochrane, if you were in this situation, what would you do? And on a napkin, Cochrane wrote out a battle plan, and that battle plan was that he would send in fire ships into the bay with the wind and the tide, the incoming tide, and he would use those fire ships to disrupt the French. So immediately, the First Lord of the Admiralty put him in command of this plan. There was very senior officers within the English Navy who were infuriated by this. There were several who were that such a junior officer would take such a command, And there was also a lot of people who were infuriated with Gambia for the fact that he had allowed this to happen. His vacillation, his inability to act had caused this to happen. So in 1809, Cochrane took command and he sent in these fire ships into the bay. He also designed platforms. He made rafts, and he put gunpowder, barrels and barrels of gunpowder on that, and he covered that with artillery shells, and he sent these in. And these destroyed a lot of French ships. A lot of other French ships panicked and tried to come out of the bay, and then they were easy prey for the rest of the English fleet. And then even more, cut their anchor lines, and they drifted ashore and ran aground. Now, these ships could be refloated, and they would still be half the French fleet could be refloated and still be a viable force. So Cochrane signalled to Gambia to come into the bay now and destroy the rest of the French fleet. But once again, Gambia hesitated. He wouldn't do it. He still thought it was too dangerous. So this caused a lot of tension between the two men, and Cochrane accused Gambia of extraordinary hesitation, which is only one rung below outright cowardice. And that was a problem. Now the battle was, even though half the French fleet had survived, the battle was seen as an English victory. In all these normal circumstances, what would happen is that the commander of the fleet, in this case Gambia, would get a hero's welcome in England. Parliament was going to give him a letter of congratulations and a monetary sum as congratulations for winning this important battle. And Cochrane told everyone that he was going to use his power as an MP to block this in Parliament, to speak against it in Parliament. Now, when Gambia heard about this, he asked for a court-martial. And Jarvis, who was the commanding admiral at the time, who Cochrane had an altercation with before, officiated at the court-martial. It was stacked in Gambia's favour. Anyone who was going to speak against Gambia was transferred. A lot of them were transferred to the Australian station at the time. And Gambia went through and was cleared at the court-martial, and he received his letter of congratulations from Parliament and a monetary sum. And that enraged Cochrane. And then we had the Great Stock Exchange Fraud of 1814, in which Cochrane was a victim. And on February 21, 1814, rumours suddenly hit London that Napoleon had been defeated in a huge battle and that he was dead. And this caused a run on the stock market. Shares went through the roof. And a particular share, a government security called Omnium, went through the roof. And Cochrane's financial advisor sold those shares at a great profit. In fact, Cochrane, his uncle, and the financial advisor made a £1.1 million profit, which was a huge sum at the time. Now, Napoleon wasn't dead. There hadn't been a battle. It was a hoax. The whole thing was a hoax. And so there was an inquiry set up. And Cochrane and his financial advisor were implicated in that. He was sent to trial, and even though there was no real evidence and to suggest that he had had anything to do with it, his financial advisor had claimed that when the stock went up, he was protecting his client's interests and he sold the shares on his client's behalf. Cochrane had nothing to do with it. Cochrane was sentenced to 12 months prison, £1,000 fine. He was dishonourably discharged from the Royal Navy. He was expelled from Parliament. He had his family banner, removed from Westminster Abbey, and he was sentenced to 1 hour of public pillory. Now, 1 hour of public pillory is when you go into the stocks. You put into the stocks and you're abused by the locals. And this cartoon here, this represents the fact that on one hand he was a naval hero, And then on the other hand, he was a crooked politician. He had his swords broken to indicate dishonour. He had his peerage taken away from him, and he was demoted. Now, public opinion was in his favour. Public opinion believed what he was saying rather than what the court was saying. So a month after he was kicked out of Parliament, his constituents re-elected him again in the by-election to elect his replacement. And later, 3 inquiries by Lord Chancellors, the highest legal person in the land, found that he had no case to answer. He had done nothing wrong. And they found him not guilty and said that it was a political witch hunt. This is what had caused this to happen. His political enemies had conspired against him. In 1832, he'd received a full pardon from Queen Victoria, and he was reinstated back into the Navy. And in 1860, the day before his funeral, his banner was restored to Westminster Abbey. And in 1876, his grandson received compensation, which today would be worth about £3.5 million. So not bad if you can get it. But in the meantime, he was ashamed. He was in disgrace. And he left England in 1818 and was given command of the Chilean Navy, who were fighting the Spanish for their independence. He reorganised the Chilean Navy along Royal Navy lines, trained his men that way, and then he was involved in the famous capture of Valdivia. Now, Valdivia was the most fortified city in South America at the time. It was a city, a very powerful Spanish city, guarded by 7 forts. He took his men ashore in some boats, 300 men. They climbed the cliffs nearby, and one by one they stealthily crept up on these forts and captured all these forts. And suddenly the Spanish had nowhere in Chile, and they had to leave the city and sue for peace. And that's how Chile got their independence. And so he's very, very famous in Chile. And then it was on to Peru. Once again, they were fighting the Spanish for independence. And the most powerful warship in the area was the Esmeralda, which had 44 guns. He and his men snuck into Callao Bay. Now, the Esmeralda was also under the protection of the guns of the fort, so they thought they were very secure. His men snuck up on boats, climbed up, overpowered the sentries, locked the crew below decks, and then sailed off in the Esmeralda. And once again, because of this, the Spanish decided that they would give Peru their independence as well. So he was 2 for 2. There's also 5 ships in the Chilean Navy that have been named in his honour. Then it was on to Brazil and their War of Independence. He was given command of their navy as well. They were fighting the Spanish for their independence. And but this time his reputation as a great naval officer, a great naval hero, made his men stand a lot taller, and his enemies wilted before him. In fact, they wilted so much they didn't even fire a shot during this campaign. He captured a city and then went to the larger cities of Mahano and Belém do Pará. And he told them that a much larger Brazilian navy was on their way, and they were going to destroy the cities. The merchants in the city complained to the Portuguese, and the Portuguese decided that they would leave, granting Brazil their independence. And he was made the Marquis of Maranhão in honour of his victory there. And then it was on to Greece. And he was given command of the Greek navy during the War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire. Eventually the British Navy came to the aid of the Greeks during that time as well. And in 1832, he returned to Great Britain. As I said, Queen Victoria had granted him a pardon. And on the 1st of July, 1831, his father died, which made him Lord Cochrane, the 10th Earl of Dundonald. As his knighthood was restored by the Queen, he was reinstated into the Royal Navy with the rank of Rear Admiral of the Blue, and then over a period of time he received 8 more promotions, finally ending up as Admiral of the Red, which was one of the highest ranks in the Royal Navy. He died on October 31, 1860, and he was interred in Westminster Abbey. And each year, on the anniversary of his death, the Chilean Navy hold a ceremony in Westminster Abbey in his honour. So very, very well regarded, and this is often attended by British royalty as well. Napoleon thought so highly of him that he named him the Sea Wolf. Horatio Hornblower, the books by C.S. Forrester, are based on the life of Cochrane. And there's been movies with Gregory Peck about Horatio Hornblower. There's been a TV series made about him. And then, as I said before, Patrick O'Brien, the author of the Master and Commander series of books, said that Captain Jack Aubrey was also based on Cochrane. And he's also mentioned in the book Sharp's Devil by Bernard Cornwell. So that's why I think you get an idea about why he's one of my childhood heroes. So the next one I wanted to talk about is the man who stole the Suez Canal. Now, the Suez Canal was opened on November 17, 1869, and it's a marvel. It goes 101 miles between the Mediterranean all the way to the Red Sea, and it made the search for the Northwest Passage null and void now, because there was a safe, secure, faster route to getting through to the riches of Asia. The head of Egypt, the ruler of Egypt at the time, Ismail Pasha, or Ishmael the Magnificent, had invited some of the great leaders of the world to the opening of the Suez Canal, including Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, Empress Eugenie from France, the Prince of Wales from England, who later became Edward VII, and also the Prince of the Netherlands, and many, many more dignitaries. And the imperial yacht Exile was supposed to be the first yacht through the Suez Canal. And this is because the French had been the leaders of the concept for the Suez Canal. They had done most of the design work for the Suez Canal. They had been in charge of the construction and put most of the finance in. It wasn't until many years later that the British actually bought 50% of the shares in the canal. And so the Exile was supposed to be have the honour of being the first ship through. But that was until George Nares came along in HMS Newport. He was, the British had opposed the construction. As I said, it wasn't until later on that they came on board. And the night before the canal was due to open, Nares, in a brilliant act of seamanship, upstanding seamanship, without any lights or anything, threaded his way through all the ships that were anchored in the harbour, ready to go through, until in the morning when the sun came up, everyone looked out and they saw the Newport in front of the Exile, and there was no way that could be passed. So officially, if you look at the official records of the Suez Canal, the French imperial vessel Exile is the first one through, but in actual fact, it was the Newport that was the first to go through. Now, he joined the Royal Navy at the age of 14 and was a midshipman on the Australian station for some time. He was second mate on HMS Resolute, and we spoke about the Resolute a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the Lost Franklin expedition. That was a ship that went, probably the best ship in the British Navy at the time. It went looking for Franklin and his lost men, his 129 men, searching for the Northwest Passage. The Resolute became stuck in the ice itself. Eventually they were ordered to leave the Resolute, abandon the ship in the ice, and make their way back to some other ships and be evacuated back to England. And then 18 months later, the Resolute was found by some American whalers and taken as a prize, taken back to Connecticut, where the US Congress purchased the vessel, restored it to its original condition, sailed it across the Atlantic and gifted it to Queen Victoria and the British people from the people of America. And then 25 years later, when the ship was broken up, it was decommissioned and was due to be broken up, Queen Victoria ordered that the best timbers of the Resolute be made into a desk. And this is the desk that's in the Oval Office at the moment. And it's been used by every president of the United States, the Resolute desk. So he had some Arctic experience while serving aboard the Resolute. And then he fought during the Crimean War. Because of his great seamanship ability and his ability to teach people all about seamanship, he was made the training officer in command of HMS Britannia, which was the where all the naval cadets, the British naval cadets, went through for their initial training. And he literally wrote the manual about seamanship. The Nares Seamanship Manual, Nares Guide to Seamanship, is probably the most famous seamanship manual ever published. It was used in the British Navy for over 100 years. Every cadet, every midshipman used this manual. It was just brilliant. It was also translated into 12 languages and was used by other navies around the world, including the Australian Navy, the American Navy, even the Swedish Navy. So a very, very famous manual. And we were cruising around on our boat last year, and we went into the Dutch city of Harlingen, where it was the finish of the tall ships race. And they had over 50 of these beautiful ships, tall ships, finish a race around Europe in Harlingen. And we volunteered to do some work at the end of the race, and it was fascinating. I mean, 50 of these beautiful ships, some of them square riggers, some of them ketchers, some of them clipper-type vessels, and they're all crewed by, or most of them are crewed by teenagers, all from all around the world, and great experience. And if you've got teenagers as children or grandchildren or great-great-great-grandchildren in some cases, I highly recommend. I mean, if you want to give them a life-changing experience, this is wonderful. We saw footage while we were there of these kids who had turned up, and they were very, very nervous before the cruise started. Very, very nervous, very shy. There was video of them trying to step up even one or two rungs into the rigging, and they were so nervous, even though they were double clipped into it. And then a month later, at the end of the race, these kids are clambering up into the rigging, standing on pieces of rope as they pull the sails up into the spars. And they've just been filled with so much confidence from that month at sea, and they've made friends for life. So highly recommended. But as I said, he wrote on the board these ships was the Nares Guide to Seamanship, and each of the people, each of the teenagers that boarded these ships was given a list of recommended reading, and the very top of that list was the Nares Guide to Seamanship. He then took command of the HMS Salamander, and he was in charge of maintaining communications between Sydney and Cape York in northern Australia. And at that time, he also did a very, very detailed survey of the Great Barrier Reef, and was the first person to find out exactly how big this reef was. And then he was given command of HMS Newport to map the Gulf of Suez, and that's when he was the first to transverse the canal. Just took advantage of the situation to go through. Because of what he'd done, the government of Egypt, or the Kingdom of Egypt, and the government of France wrote these very stern diplomatic cables to the English, complaining about what he'd done. So he was publicly reprimanded, and then he was given the Distinguished Service Medal, and he was promoted. And then he was given command of HMS Challenger, and this was a 3-year journey to circumnavigate the world and map or give details of the world's deepest oceans. And nothing was really known about. We knew about the coastlines of countries, we knew about the shallows, but we didn't really know a lot about the deepest parts of the world. And he was given this job because of his expertise and scientific and surveying experience. Now, they had to use 181 miles of Italian hemp rope during this voyage to get down to the bottom of the ocean. They sent down thermometers to measure the temperature. They sent down jars to try and collect samples from the bottom. And the scientific work that he did was just outstanding, and he was commended for that work. He was the Challenger was the first propelled ship to go into the Arctic Ocean, and the Nares Deep, which is the deepest part of the Atlantic, is named in his honour. Now, when he did that, the Admiralty decided to give him an even more arduous mission, and that was to go to the opposite end of the Earth and into the Arctic. So he took command of the British Arctic expedition of 1875 with 2 ships, the Discovery and the Alert, and the job was to try and get as close to the North Pole as possible. He was the first person to sail between Greenland and Ellesmere Island, which is part of Canada, and that's named the Nares Strait in his honour. And his sledging party gained the record for going the furthest north at the time, the closest to the North Pole. When he returned home, he was knighted and later retired as a Vice Admiral. He died on January 15th, 1915, at the age of 83, only 3 months after he got into his full naval uniform as a Vice Admiral with all these ribbons and things, marched into the Admiralty and volunteered for service in the Royal Navy at the age of 83 to serve during World War I. But that application was rejected. The Challenger mission was probably his most famous accomplishment, his greatest accomplishment, but he'll be always remembered as the man that stole the Suez Canal. Now, the next person I wanted to talk about is a famous Australian, and some of you probably know Sir Douglas Mawson. He was one of the leaders, along with Amundsen, Scott and Shackleton, in the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. He'd been born in England in 1882, but was very, very lucky that his family decided to emigrate to Australia before he was 2 years old. He educated at Sydney University, became a geologist, and he was actually the person who discovered the mineral davidite, and he named that after his very good friend and mentor, Edgeworth David, another scientist. In the 1907 Shackleton-Nimrod expedition, they cruised along the coast of Australia and pulled into Adelaide, where Mawson now lived. He was at the University of Adelaide. And they convinced him to come on the expedition with him. So he did. He went with Shackleton. And him and Edgeworth David and another man were the first men to actually reach the magnetic South Pole, which is different to the geographical South Pole. And they're also the first people to summit Mount Erebus, which is the highest active volcano, the most southern active volcano in the world. He was invited to go with Scott on his quest to the Antarctic, his ill-fated quest, but decided against it because he believed that Scott was there to try and reach the pole. That was Scott's priority, where he was more a scientist. He wanted to do this for science's sake. So he decided to lead the Australian Antarctic expedition to make it a very, very scientific expedition. So they sailed south aboard the vessel Aurora, which Shackleton was later to use famously, and they got to a place called Commonwealth Bay, and they thought this looks like a good place to set up a base camp. Now, in his diaries, he noted that it was a bit breezy, but it turns out that Commonwealth Bay is actually the windiest place in the world. It's the average wind speed is 50 miles per hour. That's the average wind speed, and it can get up to 200 miles per hour very regularly. So it's very difficult place to be. They built huts there, and they wintered there for the first year. Now, you might have, when we were in Hobart, some of you might have walked past the replica huts that, or even been into the replica huts, the Mawson huts that were there. I don't know if you did or not, but they're there at Franklin, on the Franklin Wharves down at the marina there. And this is some photos. Now, you can see how crowded it was in these huts with all these men, but it was suicidal to go outside. It was so cold and windy. They took a man along by the name of Francis Bickerton, who was a pilot, and he was going to be the very first person to fly a plane in Antarctica and do a lot of the survey and scientific work from that plane. But that became impossible because of the weather conditions there, the wind and also the cold. So Bickerton put his mind to another venture, and he set up the very first wireless communication from Antarctica directly with Australia, which was going to prove to be very useful down the track. And this is part of the radio thing here. There's someone getting a shave there, but this is part of the radio setup as well. Now, Bickerton was an interesting man. This is him here. He was later asked to join Shackleton's next expedition to venture across, to hike across Antarctica. But he was a pilot, and World War I had broken out just before Shackleton left. And Bickerton at the last minute decided to pull out because he believed that Britain would need all the pilots they had during World War I. So he went on and became a famous pilot. He became an ace. He was shot down, he was wounded 3 times by enemy fire, shot down on 2 occasions, but became a very famous, he was flying Sopwith camels and was very successful during the First World War. And he was also successful during this expedition as well because he was the person to find the Adelie land meteorite, the very first meteorite to be found in Antarctica. And that's a very famous mineral. And Antarctica is now known as the home of meteorites. It's the largest meteorite field in the world. So the plan was, when spring came, that the group would be split up into different parties and go off and explore the Arctic for scientific research. And the far eastern party was going to be commanded by Mawson with 2 other men, Xavier Mertz, who was a Swiss ski instructor. Now, there wasn't too much skiing in Australia during those times, so Mertz was brought along so he could train the men in how to ski, because Mawson thought this was a good way for him to get across the ice easier. And the second man was a man by the name of Belgrave Ninnis, who was an army officer. His father had been on the Arctic expedition commanded by Sir George Nares. So he wanted to emulate his father and go to the Arctic regions, or in this case the Antarctic. And this is a photograph taken by Frank Hurley of the famous Australian photographer who later went with the Shackleton expedition and was the official Australian war photographer during World War I. And this is showing the northeastern party as they set off on their voyage, on their journey. They got out, they travelled for 5 weeks and got out to about 480 kilometres away from the base camp. And then on 15th of December, disaster struck. Mertz was skiing out in front, and he turned and indicated that they were crossing a crevasse, which they did on most days. It wasn't an unusual thing to happen. And then next along came Mawson. He was on his sledge, and he went across without any trouble at all. And then when the 2 men looked back, they saw that Ninnis had disappeared down into the crevasse. They raced back, and they looked down in the crevasse. The sledge and Ninnis had gone. About 30 metres or about 100 feet below, they could see a dead husky and also an injured husky. But they didn't even have the rope now to get down that far to see what had happened. They called out to their companion for 3 hours before finally realising that he was dead. He was gone. There would be nothing that they could do. But it was... they also lost the sledge, along with their 6 best dogs, their only tent, most of their rations, all their additional clothing, and so now they only had 1 week of food left amongst them. But even worse than that, they didn't have any shelter at all. So they had no choice. A week before, they had thought they had too much equipment with them, so they'd abandoned some equipment, including a tent cover. So this was they had the tent, and then the cover went over the top of the head of the tent to provide extra protection. And they'd abandoned that tent cover a week before. So they really had no other choice but to sledge 27 hours away from base camp to try and find this tent cover. They couldn't stop until they got there because this was their only protection from the elements. And when they finally found it, and they were able to use the skis that Mertz had to make a cover and make this tent, make a tent that reached all the way down to the ice. They had to slaughter some of their dogs to feed the other dogs, and also for sustenance to add to their own rations because they didn't have a lot of food. And they found that themselves suffering from a range of ill effects like dizziness, nausea, cramping, abdominal pain. They became irrational at times and couldn't think properly. Their hairs and nails fell out, and they had yellowing of the eyes and the skin. And it seemed obvious that poor old Mertz was going crazy. He was going insane as they went along. And on one occasion he thought he had frostbite on his fingers, but he didn't. And he actually bit through his finger and chewed his finger off because he thought he had frostbite. Eventually, Mawson had to tie Mertz to the sledge and haul him along behind him. And what had happened is that he'd fallen into madness. Now, Mertz found it very, very difficult to eat the husky flesh when they slaughtered the dogs. So he'd been given the internal organs of the huskies to eat. And it turns out that husky liver contains a very, very concentrated amount of vitamin A. And vitamin A in big doses causes madness. Now, it's probably too late for some of you, but to give you this warning, but if you're having the husky pate up in the cafe on your toast, just do it sparingly. And by husky pate, I mean Marmite. No, I'm just joking. And Mertz died, finally died on the 8th of January 1913, and now Mawson was on his own in the ice. He was 100 miles from safety and pulling this sledge on his own. On January 17th, he fell into a crevasse. He was only saved by the fact that he had his harness on, which was attached to the sledge, and that the sledge had wedged into the top of this crevasse. He hauled himself hand over hand up to the top of the crevasse, which was only a few metres, but that was very difficult to do. And then he slipped and fell back again. And he said later that he considered just undoing the harness and falling to oblivion. And he also said that sometimes it's harder to fight for survival than it is to just embrace the warm blanket of death. But he made it out. He made it out of the crevasse and he kept on going. And on January 29th, he found a snow can, or a pile of snow, and inside that he found some supplies. His men had been out searching for the party, and they'd left this food supply in the hope that he would find it. Unfortunately, they'd left only 3 hours before he arrived, and he still had 23 miles to go to safety. By this time, he was in awful condition. The soles had separated from his feet so badly that he could see into the inside of his feet. So he had to tape them up. He had to bind them up again and put on his boots and keep going. And he said that every step he took was complete agony. But on February the 8th, 1913, he finally came across Commonwealth Bay. Only to see a speck in the distance was the Aurora sailing off into the distance. It had left a few hours before. Luckily, they'd left 6 men at the base who were going to be searching for the missing party. They radioed the Aurora and said, "Come back," but it couldn't get back into the bay because of the ice that was coming in there. It had stayed as long as it possibly could. So they had to stay, those 6 men, along with Mawson, had to stay another winter in Commonwealth Bay. But they used that time well, and they continued to collect samples and make observations while they were there. And because of that, it's seen as one of the great expeditions of all, scientific expeditions of all time. He finally returned to Australia, to Adelaide, on February 26, 1914. It was a hero's welcome. Because of the radio communication, they knew he was alive, they knew he was okay, and they knew when he was going to be returning. And just over a month later, he married his fiancée, Francisca, and they had 2 daughters. And he resided in Adelaide for the rest of his life. He was knighted, and then during World War I, he was served in the army and rose to the rank of major. And his story is seen to be the greatest solo survival story in the history of Arctic exploration. And the Australian Antarctic expedition is regarded today as one of the great scientific expeditions of all time because of the scientific work that they did during that time. He died in 1958 and was the last of the great polar leaders of the heroic era of Antarctic exploration. So that's why he's one of my heroes. And he's got a statue at Adelaide University. You can go there tomorrow and have a look at it. But a great man himself. So ladies and gentlemen, that's three of my heroes. I don't know whether you knew all of them or any of them, but I hope you've learnt something today. My next talk's in about 3 days' time, I think. It's about the mutiny on the Batavia. Now, I've got to warn you, the mutiny on the Batavia makes the mutiny on the Bounty look like a Walt Disney fairy tale. So be told. And as I said, what are we going to say tonight? Go Pies. Thank you.